And of course, it's just escalating. These protesters escalate as far as you allow them to escalate. Remember, during the BLM days, they blockaded whole roads, took over whole parts of the city as an independent territory. In Minneapolis this morning, the instigators from yesterday's deadly anti-ICE incident are creating barricades around the intersection where it took place, using wooden pallets, garbage cans, tires, and traffic cones. Those guarding the barricades told CNN they are members of the immigrant community. Notice how they spell honor with an OU. Foreign agitators. Another show of power. They just openly threatened to kill ICE agents, and nothing is done about it.
Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you! You're gonna fucking die, bitch! Fuck you!
We're going to effing find you. We're going to effing kill you. You're going to effing die. The time for Trump to finally invoke the fabled Insurrection Act we've been hearing about so much. Send in U.S. military forces, our full-time professional military, not the National Guard of a state, and seize control of these American cities that are in active insurrection against the federal government. The thing to keep in mind is 12406 is not the only provision under which the president can call forth military forces, even the National Guard. There are other provisions under which Trump can call forth the National Guard. One of those is the Insurrection Act. And this recent decision from the Supreme Court has nothing to do with the Insurrection Act. It only has to do with that federal statute 12406. Before we get into anything, let's take a look at what's the biggest barrier to the president calling forth the military forces to be used domestically within the United States. Posse Comitatus. And this is an actual statute. And the statutory form, the modern statutory form of Posse Comitatus is this statute 1385 that reads, whoever, and really it just means if the president, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress, those are big carve-outs, willfully uses any part of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or the Space Force, they updated it for Space Force, as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws, engaged in law enforcement function, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. Now look at all the carve-outs that are here. So first of all, it only prohibits the use of the military if they're being used to execute the laws, to act as law enforcement, not if they're just being used to protect person and property. So Posse Comitatus does not prohibit the president from calling out just the full-time military, the Army, to protect persons and property, as long as they're not engaged in a law enforcement function. But there's more carve-outs, right? What's the president authorized to do under the Constitution? That opens up a lot of doors. Is there a foreign insurrection against the U.S.? Do these immigrant protests qualify as those pro-immigrant? I mean, these are foreigners. Or an act of Congress could allow him to do this. One of those was 12406, and the Supreme Court decided that an unelected black-robed tyrannical inferior district trial court judge had the authority to decide on a preliminary basis, issuing a preliminary injunction that the conditions for 12406 had not been met. That's why Trump was obliged to withdraw the state National Guard troops. But of course, the full-time military are a different matter entirely. When we're talking the state National Guard, the militia power is controlled by Congress. They define the terms under which the president can use it. But the president has his own unique authorities to deploy the military under the Constitution, as expressly authorized by the Constitution. He's the commander-in-chief, or an act of Congress. And we're going to look at an act of Congress that authorizes the president to call out the military. And that is, of course, what we colloquially refer to as the Insurrection Act. This is the statute 12406 that we've been talking about. This was the one that Trump has used to call out various National Guards that the Supreme Court effectively just checked him on, inappropriately, I think. And it provides its own conditions under which Trump can activate state National Guards. Remember, he wasn't sending in full-time military. If the United States is being invaded, that doesn't apply, obviously. If there's a rebellion or a danger of rebellion. Now, the underlying federal court said, I just don't believe these affidavits from these ICE officers that there's a rebellion or danger, the level of violence that they're facing. Either it was transitory, it stopped happening, or it's overstated, or I think they're just a bunch of liars, which of course was an insane thing for the judge to conclude. There were thousands of pages of these affidavits, and she pointed to two of them, 2 pages, and said, I don't believe that, so therefore I'm discounting the entire thing. But nevertheless, she's been allowed to have that stick in terms of a preliminary injunction. And the third condition is if the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And the key question in the Supreme Court on this was, well, what's regular forces? Trump says regular forces are ICE. I'm unable with ICE to execute the laws. And the other side says, no, regular forces means the full-time military. You have to try the full-time military first. The other issue, of course, was I'm unable to execute the laws. What does unable mean? The trial court judge, the unelected black-robed tyrannical inferior district trial court judge, essentially said, well, if you try 1,000,000 times and you're only able to be successful once, well, then you're able. You're able to enforce the law. You managed to do it 1 out of 1,000,000 times. That's obviously an insane position, but that's where we are at the moment. So 12406 was not permitted by the Supreme Court to allow Trump to send forth the National Guard. Now, of course, we have Tim Walz threatening to bring forth the National Guard. The same governor, by the way, who's previously declared repeatedly, yesterday and today, that Minnesota is at war against the federal government.
And it's clear, look, I don't think any governor in history has had to fight a war against the federal government every single day.
Well, I said this yesterday. We've never been at war with our federal government.
And it's clear, look, I don't think any governor in history
Is Minnesota at war?
Has had to fight a war.
No governor in history has had to fight a war. Does he not know about the Civil War? Governor Walz revealed that 7,800 National Guard troops are in training for a possible deployment, so he's threatening deployment, and has sent out a warning notice preparing troops that may be deployed against federal immigration agents. A governor preparing state troops against the federal law enforcement is a red line. Walz made sure to make it clear he hasn't made a final decision on deploying troops to the streets of Minneapolis. He accused the ICE agent who was attacked by a Democrat activist of murder. So he hasn't done it yet. He's just threatening to do it.
Order to prepare the Minnesota National Guard. We have soldiers in training and prepared to be deployed if necessary. I remind you, a warning order is a heads up for folks. And these National Guard troops are our National Guard troops. They're teachers in your community. They're business owners.
That's us versus them. State militia against federal authority.
They're construction professionals. They are Minnesotans. Minnesota will not allow our community to be used as a prop in a national political fight. We will not take the bait. We will continue to update you, Minnesota, as we get more information. Now I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner.
A little more Tim Walz. I know you can't get enough.
I don't know what to tell you, and I don't quite know how to respond to the question other than my primary responsibility as governor is the protection of the people of Minnesota. And you can be assured whether it's the State Patrol or whether it's the National Guard, their deployment is there to protect Minnesotans from whatever it is. If it's an act of nature, if it's a global pandemic, or in this case, if it is a rogue federal agent. I don't know at this time. And I want.
Guess who gets to decide if a federal agent is being rogue? It's not a state governor. He doesn't get to make that call. The federal government makes that call, not the state. The federal government is not subordinate to any state governor. All right, here's J.D. Vance saying, I want every ICE officer to know that the president, vice president, the entire administration stands behind them. To the radicals assaulting them, doxing them, and threatening them, congratulations. We're going to work even harder to enforce the law. And I'm like, okay, great, JD. But what are you actually doing? What are you actually doing? What is the administration actually doing to help these guys? I mean, they're facing organized, seditious resistance. And Trump says he'll be ready to send troops, National Guard or military troops back in. This was on his Air Force One gaggle the other day.
You know that Portland, we got it down to almost no crime. Do you know that? But we pulled it out. We had a Supreme Court decision. We could go back. We're allowed to go back in. But we'll go back in with the crime starts. Look.
So when he says we can go back, we're allowed back in, what he's talking about is what I mentioned at the start, what we're going to get to again in just a moment. There are lots of provisions under which the president is authorized to deploy National Guard and military forces. within the U.S. And I know what you're saying. You say, well, if he does that, some unelected, black-robed, you too can have one of these mugs, unelected, black-robed, tyrannical, inferior federal district trial court judges, the link is in the description, my friends, we'll just issue a preliminary injunction. Well, isn't that what's going to happen? Isn't that what's been happening for a year? And the answer is, yeah, I would expect that to happen. And what Trump should do is just ignore it. Just ignore it. And if that sounds outrageous, it's been done before. It's been done before by one of our, well, opinions vary, one of our most prominent presidents, Abraham Lincoln. So we all know what habeas corpus is, right? Habeas corpus is if you're grabbed by the federal government or any governmental authority within the U.S., you have a right to be presented in federal court in front of a judge and have the authorities explain to the judge why they're holding you. So we don't have secret detentions in America. Habeas corpus, you have the body, produce the body in court and justify why you're stripping this person of their individual liberty by putting them in a cage. It's one of the most vital of Americans' civil rights. Carries lots of weight in the U.S. Constitution. But habeas corpus can be suspended. Now, it requires, we've always taken the position as a nation that suspending habeas corpus requires an act of Congress to do that the president himself doesn't have the authority. And the reason we do that is because the language in the Constitution that deals with suspending habeas corpus is in Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1, of course, is the legislative branch of power of the Constitution. So it makes sense to interpret the language as being a power of Congress, not a power of the president. And there have been many times in American history where presidents have suspended habeas corpus. You can just have secret detentions. The government can just lock people up and not have to explain to anybody why they're doing it. It's pretty serious stuff. But every time a president has suspended habeas corpus, it was with the authority of Congress. Congress delegated that authority to the president, therefore the president could exercise it. The president didn't have independent authority. And of course, our current Congress is feckless and useless, so they're not going to grant President Trump the authority to suspend habeas corpus. But he could do it anyway. He could just do it. He could just say, I'm doing it. And then what would happen? Some court would say, you're not allowed. And Trump could say, too bad, and make it stick. And how do we know that? Because it's been done. Abraham Lincoln did it during the Civil War. He would suspend habeas corpus in areas of the country that looked like they might go over to the Confederacy, looked like there was rebellion brewing. And as you might imagine, there were lots of areas like that, right? In a Civil War divided nation. He would just suspend habeas corpus. And the Supreme Court itself told him, you're not allowed to do that. You don't have that authority. Congress has not said you could do this, so you don't have the independent authority to suspend habeas corpus. And you know what Lincoln said? Too bad. I'm doing it anyway. He said exigent circumstances. Now, exigent circumstances is a legal term of art that basically just means, yeah, but not in this case. So it's used a lot in law enforcement, right? So normally law enforcement needs a warrant to enter your home, to do a search, to look around. But what if they saw flames shooting out a window? Or they heard a woman screaming for help? Well, then they don't need a warrant. They can kick in your door and go in because of the exigent circumstances. And Lincoln just said exigent circumstances. So I'm going to suspend habeas corpus. And he made it stick. Now, later, Congress did delegate him the authority. But at the time Lincoln was making the decision and suspending habeas corpus, he didn't have congressional authority. He just did it. Because sometimes you can just do things. If Lincoln can just do things, why can't Trump just do things? All right, the actual law now. So let's talk about Eisenhower. Eisenhower Executive Order 10730. I'm going to show that to you in just a moment, but a little history first. Desegregation of Central High School in 1957. So May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education says you can't have separate but equal schools anymore. Separate, but they said they were inherently unequal. White schools, black schools, can't do it anymore. The schools U.S. public schools have to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. Arkansas was a southern state, of course, and Arkansas said, we're going to comply. We're going to desegregate our schools. But the citizens of Arkansas were not very happy about this. So protests started. There was some violence. And the governor of Arkansas said, hey, I'm going to call out the National Guard to maintain order. And Eisenhower said, hey, let's have a chat about what's going on there. And he sat down with Eisenhower, who was president at this time. And Eisenhower said, well, all right, I mean, I don't have any objection to you calling out the National Guard to maintain order, so long as the order is the integration of the schools. And the governor of Arkansas said, yeah, that's why I'm doing it. But then the night before the desegregation was to start, the governor decided not to call out the Arkansas National Guard. And there was disorder, and there was violence, and people were blocking the desegregation. So President Eisenhower himself activated National Guard and sent in the 101st Airborne, M1 Garand rifles, lengthy and sharp bayonets on the end. This guy holding his arm here, he looks like to me like he might have taken a cut from one of those bayonets. The U.S. military sent in the 101st Airborne, Eisenhower did, under Executive Order 10730, to use bayonets to compel compliance with the desegregation order, and not just against men, women too. Pretty dramatic stuff. And of course, segregation was enforced. And that proclamation, that executive order, I have it here. See if I can make it big enough to be legible. So obviously typed on a typewriter. This is how things were done. Executive Order 10730, where certain persons in the state of Arkansas, individually and in unlawful assemblages, combinations, and conspiracies, have willfully obstructed the enforcement of orders of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Arkansas. Does this sound like what's happening in Minnesota? And so I, Eisenhower, by the authority vested in me by the Constitution, inherent commander-in-chief authority, and statutes, the Insurrection Act statutes, 332, 333, 334. Now, those have now been renumbered. Do command all persons engaged in such obstruction of justice to cease and desist and disperse. And what these statutes did was allow him to deploy the military. The most important of those, now renumbered 252, use of militia and armed forces to enforce federal authority. And it reads, and this is much broader authority, much less conditioned than 12406. Whenever the president considers, that's complete deference to him. Whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impracticable, not impossible, much broader than 124, not unable, impracticable to enforce the laws of the U.S. in any state, any of the laws, including immigration laws, by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, he may call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress rebellion. Remember Posse Comitatus? It said you can't deploy the military to execute the laws unless Congress, by an act of law, had given you permission. This is that permission. This is the workaround around Posse Comitatus. This is what Trump would use. Sorry about that, is what Trump would use to issue a proclamation, an executive order, and send the full-time military into Minneapolis or any other place where he considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States is taking place. Is that Minneapolis? Is that anywhere these pro-migrant protests are taking place? The answer is yes. So President Trump has every authority he needs to deploy military troops. He just has to be willing to invoke that statute, 252, commonly known as the Insurrection Act.